Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast most affected by the shortage of ADHD medication in the UK. I'm Ben Molyneux Hetherington and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Say hi, Adam.
Hello.
Adam, it is a momentous day for the podcast. Do you know why?
Oh no, why?
It is the debut of a brand new recording room for me.
I can tell, that's why it sounds so echoey.
Oh, for fuck! Do you know what? This is like I've got some cushions. It's a small room. Like this is like so. I think we might have talked about this on the podcast before, but Adam has a real thing about the rooms I record in not being the right sort of rooms, but also for various life reasons. I think I've recorded in like 6 different rooms, while you have recorded almost every episode in exactly the same spot.
No, that's not true. I've moved once.
Did you not? I thought you'd always recorded where you are now.
No, since we started, I have moved house once.
Right.
But also I've done 1 or 2 episodes from other people's houses and somehow managed to find, relatively decent sounding places.
I, on the other hand, have recorded in a multitude of different places.
Don't care.
I every time I'm like, okay, this room should be all right. I think it's like the 6th room I've recorded this podcast in, and each and every one you have hated with a burning passion.
Yeah. I just expect... Well, I don't expect anymore, let's be honest. But I hope for, a certain level of professionalism.
Yeah, I don't know why. There's no reason to hope for that. Adam, should we crack straight in with our usual opening segment, What Else Is On My Mind Grapes?
What else is on my mind, grapes?
I made a reference to the current shortage of ADHD medication in the UK, and I think, Adam, that might also have been on your mind grapes.
Oh, do you know how long it's taken me? I'm not joking here. It took me literally 10 years from first going to see my GP to actually getting a diagnosis of ADHD, right? And then it took more than a year after that of actually waiting to have access to medication. And then most recently, I've been on this medication and then I got it's not perfect, there's some issues with it. And I got this phone call 3 days before I was due my next appointment saying that the guy that I have my appointment with has injured himself. And so, which is fine. That's fair enough. That happens.
This is such an Adam story as well.
Yeah. I know.
A bunch of things have gone wrong that you had no control over, but would only happen to you.
Well, to be fair, they happened to this guy. I'm not the one who's injured myself. This guy apparently hurt himself doing something. I don't know. But that's fair enough. But it means that they've pushed back my appointment by a month and a half. So I've rung them up and I've said, well, when they've rung me up, I've said, oh, fine, but I've run out of meds. Can you send me some more meds? And they're like, yeah, that's fine. I'll get that sorted. And I've been waiting more than 2 weeks. I've been going into the pharmacy saying, have you got my thing yet? And they're like, no, it's not here. So I finally rung them up today and I said, where are my meds? And they're like, oh, well, we've got a note on the system here saying that you haven't been taking the meds in the right way and that you basically can't have any until your next review appointment, which is in a month's time. And I'm like, but you told me that you were going to sort the meds out.
Adam, be honest with me. Have you been putting the meds up your bum?
Why would you do that with ADHD meds?
Well, they said you've been taking them the wrong way, so that's my immediate assumption.
No, basically, here's the thing, right? So ADHD meds are a stimulant, or most, not all, but most ADHD meds are a stimulant, which means that they affect your brain in some really weird ways. And for me, it does things like, I already struggle with sleep, but it makes it very, very hard to sleep. And I think there's also some issues with my kidneys there as well, right? So they have side effects, and some of those side effects can be pretty nasty, which is why, by the way, you shouldn't, as someone told me an associate of theirs had done when they were teaching abroad, just throw ADHD meds at children who won't be quiet when you're teaching English. I couldn't believe it when I heard that. So yeah, anyway, they're saying, oh, you've got to wait all this time. But that isn't the half of it, right? Because for some unknown reason, the ADHD, I don't know if this is the case across the country, but the ADHD services where I am are not on the computer system yet for prescriptions. right? So when you go to your doctor, you say, "Oh, can I get a prescription of whatever?" And they'll send it to your pharmacist, and it will be done in like 1, 2, 3 days, right? For these meds, right? The only person who could prescribe them. It's comical how awful this is. The only person who could prescribe them is only in work 1 day a week and only for half a day. So you have to catch them on a Tuesday morning or you cannot get your prescription, right? And then, because they're not on the system, they're not on the computer system, they have to send your prescription by post. Right? So not only have you got to catch them like on that 1 day a week, then they've got to send them. So basically it takes 2 weeks to get a prescription, right? And I couldn't believe it when they told me this, because they know it's terrible as well. They're like, yeah, we know.
Yeah.
But I couldn't believe it when they told me this, because I was like, of all the NHS services to have this kind of issue with, where it's not on the system, you have to catch them at exactly the right time on exactly the right day. ADHD services? Are you for real? Like, I cannot be the only person with ADHD using this service who, like, just routinely forgets to ask them for a repeat prescription. Like, how have they not? How is this a thing?
And even if you manage to get your prescription sorted, there is a major shortage in the country of ADHD meds.
Well, that's why it took me so long to actually get them, right, once I'd been given a prescription, because they weren't prescribing to new patients.
And I think it's a reflection, there's issues about supply chains and, COVID and the impact and all the rest of it.
Brexit and all of it, yeah.
Brexit, yeah. But I think it's a reflection on a couple of things. One is that the NHS is kind of falling to pieces. And the reality is, the funding's been cut year on year. And there's always this thing about, people talk about, we cut in a way that preserves frontline services. But as anyone who has done any sort of public sector work will tell you, frontline services rely quite heavily on non-frontline services to do their job. So it's all well and good saying, well, there's now double the number of prescribers available. But if the people who actually run the administrative side are no longer in place, and your prescribers having to do a job that they're not actually trained or qualified or really actually that suited to doing, as well as being the actual job of a prescriber, things actually just run much worse. And that's not to say that there aren't places where potentially, there's been overspend and consultancy fees and all the rest of it. Like, obviously, there is some of that goes on. But the reality is that actually, when you cut those services behind the scenes, the frontline services get markedly worse and they have markedly less time to actually do their job.
I mean, I remember Rishi Sunak, sometime before the election, it was a couple of months before the election, doing a speech where he was responding to the fact that there are now like 3 times as many people off sick as there were before the Tories came to power. And he's like doing this speech where he's like, this is ridiculous. Like, people are not 3 times sicker than they were before we came to power.
Well,
and he's using this to sort of justify.
I feel 3 times sicker every time I see a fucking Tory Prime Minister. So.
In 2011, 20% of those doing a work capability assessment were deemed unfit to work. But the latest figure now stands at 65%. That's wrong. People are not 3 times sicker than they were a decade ago.
People are 3 times sicker because you've cut and cut and cut and cut. And those cuts will make people sicker. And it's not that hard to understand how that works. And realistically, I don't know how much of it is him not understanding how that works and how much of it is him knowing exactly how that works, but using it as a pretext to pursue punitive legislation.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions, or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
That's the problem with people who are both stupid and evil. It's often hard to tell which one of them they're being at any given moment, right?
And being as rich as he is tends to kind of blur those lines even further. So
yeah, exactly. I think the other thing it reflects about the NHS, and you want to be really careful because obviously, I mean, the far right or hard right or whatever you want to call it, would like us to move to an American insurance-based system, right? Because there's a lot more money to be made and all the rest of it, and we do not want that. That is bad. It is a good basic principle that all medical care should be free at the point of delivery. Even if you're an immigrant, I'll add that in because that's, obviously increasingly an issue. But at the same time, we have to recognise that there is an internal culture to the NHS that is, I guess, paternalistic and actually views patients as essentially idiots that need to be told what to do rather than as people who are the experts in their own experiences and lives and bodies. And that's not to say that you should be able to walk in and say, I'm pretty sure I have leukemia because I've just got a bad feeling today. That's obviously a stupid way of doing things. But actually taking people seriously and taking their experiences seriously is a more effective form of medicine than one in which you assume people are idiots who don't know what they're talking about. And I think, unfortunately, the NHS does have quite a heavy streak of assuming people are stupid and just need to be told what to do.
I think some of that is beginning to change. But yes, some of that culture that we have more broadly around seeing the NHS as the closest thing we have to an actual religion that most of us agree upon in this country does have that kind of effect. And I think you're right. I mean, the number of doctors I've been to where I say to them, even casually, even in passing or as something that's relevant to something else. Oh yeah, of course, because I'm autistic. And they just flat out don't believe me.
Yeah.
We believe in self-ID on this. It's not the right thing. That's for trans people, isn't it? What's the right thing?
To be clear, we also believe in self-ID for trans people. Let's just be 100% clear on that. But we also believe in self-diagnosis, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah. Self-diagnosis. So we believe in self-diagnosis for many, many reasons. But that was not what was going on here. It's no, I literally have an NHS diagnosis.
Yes, I have
and you don't believe me. What is this? Which leads me to the key point here, Ben. You say that, these are the things that we can understand about the NHS. This is what shows us about the NHS. I think actually the key takeaway here is that I am personally persecuted by the NHS and the Tories. I think that's actually what's going on here. As always, my life is a reflection of not just broader Tory policy, but targeted, deliberate nastiness aimed at me. That's what I think.
I can kind of see that, but having known you for a little while now, Adam, and kind of observed your life, it feels to me like you are being personally persecuted by the universe a lot of the time. I'm sure the Tories and the NHS have some role to play here, but...
I was going to say the great Tory god in the sky rears his head once again,
Yeah, Yeah, well, and I think, actually, if the NHS is our national religion, it might not be unlike our official national religion of the Church of England, in which there might be a few good people doing some good stuff, but overall it's in desperate need of overhaul and has some really dodgy ideological underpinnings.
I just can't disagree with that.
The only difference is I don't want to abolish the NHS.
Whoa, okay.
I believe I have some hope for the NHS and the principles it embodies. I will say no more.
No comment.
Shall we move on to our main topic of the day?
Oh God, do we have to?
Well, we could just sit here in silence for like 40 minutes.
I think, honestly, that's probably a better idea than what we're about to talk about.
It might be more insightful, really. We are going to talk about our brother in Christ, Paul Marshall. Is he Sir Paul Marshall? Am I getting that right? I always forget if he's a Sir.
I feel like, not. Can we do that again? I want to try that again. Could you just announce his name again? And that's what we're going to do.
We're going to talk about brother in Christ, Paul Marshall.
That bleep is really long. Why did it go on so long?
Well, it's because you usually swear for a lot longer than that. Yeah. So, Sir Paul Marshall, another shining example of the wonders of our honour system, has been in the news in the last few months. He is a hedge fund manager historically, and he has branched out into being a media tycoon. Two of our most respectable professions. Really someone who's, only got the good of the country at their heart, a hedge fund manager come media tycoon. And he first launched the website Unheard, which is...
a festering cesspool of far-right shit. Yeah.
but in a very, we're here to do unorthodox thinking. We're here to push against the default thing. We're here to go against the crowd. And it just happens that everything we think is really far-right bullshit.
That is just modern fascism, isn't it?
Yeah, well. And then, because that wasn't blatantly far-right enough for him, he was then one of the people who set up GB News, which obviously is a
festering cesspool of far-right shit.
Thank you. Let's hope you come with that. But of a very different type. It aims to be a lot more populist. Unheard is a slightly more kind of, we're very smart and intelligent and we like to discuss things at dinner party, far-right cesspool of shit. Whereas GB News is a bit more of a populist cesspool. I hesitate to call it populist for two reasons. One is that populist is quite a nebulous term that mostly seems to exist to group together kind of slightly left of centre thinkers with actual fascists.
I think you mean the hard left.
Yeah. If Jeremy Corbyn's a populist and also Nigel Farage is, well, what value does that term have? But also, populist kind of implies it's popular, and it is not actually that popular, despite what you might think because of the outsized media coverage this media organisation gets. Its actual viewership and listenership is not particularly strong, and it's hemorrhaging money. It exists purely as an ideological tool, and we know that because Marshall and his mates are throwing money at it hand over fist with no expectation, as far as anyone can tell, of actually ever turning a profit on it. So it's not a business venture. It's an attempt to push discourse in this country in a significantly far-right direction, one that, has not been without its successes, sadly. Marshall then kind of popped up in the news because he is interested in buying the Telegraph and the Spectator, two of our finest publications that are, Adam, if you please.
A festering cesspool of far-right shit.
Particularly, look, the Telegraph is obviously quite far right. It's kind of associated with slightly more, the right of the Tory party. It was always a little bit suspicious of David Cameron and his hippy-dippy ways.
Yeah, but it was never as bad as it's become.
Sure, I think, I'm talking about the right of the Tory party, but not the kind of far right. It maybe dipped its toes in a little bit.
It's not as bad as The Spectator.
Yeah. Whereas The Spectator is pretty outright fascists. Like, I don't want to, like, you know, I know there's this thing about, you overuse the term fascist, but it's published multiple people that have done Holocaust denial, so it kind of feels like fascist is the right.
Oh, and more than that, I mean, it has like outright praised fascist groups and so on as well. So, like,
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, like, not, you know, 95% of the time, the stuff that you're reading isn't necessarily going to be like actual fascist stuff.
Yeah. And it's famously a haven for writers that have had to leave other publications after they've been caught being violent towards women or abusive or, you know, various other grim things. It's the place to come and whine about how you've been cancelled, because these days you can't even push your wife down a flight of stairs. That is not a random example. That is, yes, one of the wonderful writers for The Spectator. So, yeah, he has shown an interest in taking over these two publications. People seem less bothered about The Spectator, but obviously the Daily Telegraph is
it's already gone, isn't it?
Yeah. But the Daily Telegraph is obviously a kind of a flagship newspaper in this country, you know.
Yeah.
There's a reason it's called the Tory Graph, and it's because it kind of still holds quite a lot of sway in the Tory world.
Well, my granddad buys it, right? And my granddad's not a Tory. Like, I mean, you know, he's especially for his age, I mean, he's surprisingly liberal, to be fair. But like, he would not see himself as a Tory, but he buys it. Apparently because it has the best crosswords, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, crosswords on the internet now. You don't need to.
Well, that's what I said to him. Or you could just buy a book of crosswords, but I don't know.
It's not the same, clearly. Anyway, Marshall got himself in a little bit of hot water when Hope Not Hate, an organisation that kind of does monitoring of far-right people, an organisation that we would probably have some critiques of being a bit centrist in its outlook, but ultimately does some good work around monitoring far-right extremism, essentially revealed that they'd been having a look through his Twitter account and looking at what he was liking and retweeting, and it was pretty grim, really. He liked a tweet that said, "The Muslim bloc keeps Sadiq Khan in power and they'll vote Labour until they can vote Muslim. The native European population is losing patience with the fake refugee invaders. If we want civilization to survive in Europe, we need to not just close the borders, but start mass expulsions immediately." Stuff that is inarguably fascist. So there was a lot of excitement and questions over whether he was an appropriate person to own a major newspaper. And it's complicated because on one level, no, I don't want someone like that owning a major newspaper. That's clearly a bad idea. But bluntly, particularly The Spectator and Telegraph to a large extent as well, is going to push shit like that in a slightly more mainstream, hidden fashion, regardless of who owns it. Him owning those magazines or newspapers is not necessarily going to make them any worse, any less dangerous. And to say, well, it's bad because he said this stuff out loud, I think is, perhaps slightly naive. The reality is that these are publications that at least have an affinity with the far right, and that the ownership is not necessarily going to make a massive difference. Just
as a quick aside, do you know who Paul Marshall's son is?
I know exactly who Paul Marshall's son is. Paul Marshall's son is Winston Marshall, who very famously was the banjo player in Mumford & Sons. A band that, if you have been through the upbringing that Adam and I have, you immediately clocked as having its roots in worship music.
Yeah.
Even if you had no idea of its background, the first time you hear Mumford & Sons, you go, oh, these fuckers have played in a worship band, haven't they?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, they seem not to have grown out of it that much.
It's really interesting, though, very quickly, a lot of what we're going to be talking about here, there's so many links, and this person's connected to this person, and this person's connected to this person, and so on. And so, we could do this kind of thing all day, as saying, oh, do you know who this is? Because, of course, Marcus Mumford of Mumford & Sons is, in actual fact, the son of two very key British Christian, sort of evangelical Christian.
I believe they headed up Vineyard in the UK.
They did,
yeah. So, yes, it's an interesting how all these links come about. The two of them did actually meet and start the band out the back of having played together in worship music. And there's obviously all these links between evangelical Christians that, I don't know, I think there's a better explanation than conspiracy theory here, and we'll drive towards that. But you can see how people end up in a conspiracist place with some of this stuff. When all these people have all these links together, or this person's son played in a band with this person's son, or this person actually did business with this person.
I mean, that's just rich people. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's, and not only is it rich people, it's rich Christians. And there ain't a lot of Christians in the country anymore, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And of course, rich people are a famously small and incestuous bunch.
Yeah. So the reason that Paul Marshall is perhaps of particular interest to us is that Paul Marshall is not just a hedge fund manager / far-right media tycoon. He is also a prominent member of Holy Trinity Brompton, the major evangelical Church of England.
Sorry.
Which bit are you censoring? Or just all of it?
Yeah.
And actually, you know, not just a prominent member, but someone who is actively involved in a lot of what they do. He is on the board of the Revitalised Trust, which is an organisation that is basically encouraging evangelical church plantings, essentially creating little clones of Holy Trinity Brompton, or HTB, up and down the country, because it's such a successful, brilliant model of the way to do things. So Paul Marshall, up until recently, probably up until the GB News stuff, if he's known to people at all, it's either as a successful businessman or a prominent Christian, and not someone who has necessarily publicly courted controversy. Obviously, first of all, being involved in GB News, and he actually took over his chair when Andrew Neil, the former Spectator editor, quit because he thought it was so unprofessional. Not because it was far-right content, obviously, because Andrew Neil is fine with that, but he couldn't bear the far-right nonsense to be unprofessional. And then, obviously, these subsequent likes and retweets and all the rest of it that have come out has maybe recast him in a different light. It is interesting to note that this is someone been given a position of prominence and authority and held up, really, internally in certain evangelical Christian culture in this country. And we may only just be finding out now about these views he holds. But I think we all know that when you have someone who holds views like that, you don't have to spend that long with them in person before it becomes clear what they believe, right? These people don't tend to hide their light under a bushel. They tend to let you know pretty early on what they think about all this sort of stuff. So it is interesting to reflect on the question of how much the leadership of these organisations knew about what Marshall believed prior to this all coming out.
Do we need to reflect on this? I mean, I think this is... and I'm being serious here. Obviously, people... You know, let's just take HTB as a case study. Obviously, not everyone who goes to HTB, not everyone on the clergy team of HTB, which is huge, by the way. It's something like 128 clergy at HTB. Not all of them are going to have the same political opinions. However, a significant number of people in the conservative evangelical wing of the church will absolutely share his opinions on these things, will absolutely just overtly say things. They might not realize that what they're saying is far right, but they do use far right talking points regularly. Case in point, and I know I always come back to it, and I know he would not claim this, but Justin Welby uses far right talking points in his book, Reimagining Britain. They're plain to see in there if you know what you're looking for. I don't think he does. I don't think he recognizes them as far-right talking points. But this stuff is in the water, is the point I'm making. It's part of what it is to be in the evangelical Christian world, certainly in this country.
Yeah, but I think as well, it's important to acknowledge that these are not just relationship links. There is hard cash changing hands. So he is good mates, Paul Marshall is, with Bishop Graham Tomlin, who is a fairly prominent evangelical bishop in the Church of England, but one who has generally shied away from going too conservative, I would say. He's obviously very conservative himself, I would say theologically and politically. I suspect he is as well, but he hasn't necessarily been someone who's, you know, spouting anti-queer rhetoric or being a supporter of far-right policies or even right policies in terms of his politics. But actually, Tomlin was a bishop for a while, and now he is the head honcho of Centre for Cultural Witness, which I had never heard of. I'd heard of Graham Tomlin because he's kind of knocked about. I think he was involved in some of the Soul Survivor stuff. Graham Tomlin went to university with Paul Marshall, Oh, and really enjoyably, they had a folk duo, so you can see where his son gets it from.
Can I just say, it really bothers me. I really like folk music. And part of my like of folk music is that it has a radical tradition. You know, it is literally, it's the music of the folk. It's the music of the people. And it really bothers me that it's now got such a clear, hard to far right grouping within it. So it's a bit like how punk also gained a far right wing as well. So yeah, just to say, not all folk is like this.
So Graham Tomlin and Paul Marshall went to university together, were mates there, stayed in contact over the years. And when Tomlin founds the Centre for Cultural Witness, it's actually Marshall who bankrolls the whole thing through his trust that's part of his asset management company. He's also splashing cash in all sorts of places. He gives a load of money to HTB. He is involved in giving loads of money to the Church Revitalisation Trust, which is another one of those places that exists to kind of propagate conservative evangelical forms of church up and down the country. There is real money being spent here by this guy. And I think it's interesting that it's not seen in the same way as him trying to buy newspapers and set up places like GB News. Yeah. And I think it absolutely should be. This is a man who is trying to buy influence. This is a man who wants to spread his way of doing things. And that is just as true as when he is throwing money hand over fist running GB News, as it is when he's throwing money at HTB and the Centre for Cultural Witness and all these other, evangelical Christian organizations. That is exactly the same thing that he is doing in both cases. He is buying influence to try and spread what he believes.
Well, yes, I think that's true, although I might sort of adjust that a little bit and say it's not necessarily yes, it is what he believes, but he's bankrolling things that are in alignment with what he believes, people who believe the same thing.
Yeah, sure. It's that old thing about journalists saying, well, no one tells me what to write. And of course, that's true. But the only reason you're being allowed to write is because you're already saying the right thing. It's the same sort of system. It's not that the Centre for Cultural Witness or the Church Revitalisation Trust goes to Paul Marshall and says, we would like some money. What would you like us to say? It is that Paul Marshall recognises that funding these organizations pushes his agenda because they're already on the same page as him. And I think it's really interesting, and I don't think it's a question these people have ever reflected on. What does it mean that someone like Paul Marshall, who is obviously switched on, he's a smart guy, he knows what he's doing, he's got a plan, and he sees funding these Christian organizations in the same way that he sees funding GB News. So what does it mean for you as a Christian organisation that you serve the same function as GB News?
Yeah, completely. Like I say, I think there are going to be some who would be concerned about that, but I think a lot of them will just be completely comfortable with that, actually.
I don't know if that's right. I think most of them would reject that premise. I think, actually, if they believed that would be a real issue for a lot of conservative evangelicals.
I don't know about most. I think I would say some of them are fine with it in the sense that they agree with it. But I think probably the predominant way of thinking about this is something that we've spoken about before. It's where essentially they don't care, right? What they care about is Christians occupying prominent positions. And I think GB News, that is what that would represent to a lot of people in that kind of world.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced by that. I think for some people, definitely, potentially for some of the higher-ups, but I think for most of the kind of mid-level and the people that maybe support these organisations but don't work for them or not, heavily involved in them, I think for those guys, a lot of them would probably say that we're being a bit silly and melodramatic and, okay, so maybe he funds this, but ultimately we do something very different and it's, he funds us, but it's a very different situation. I don't think they would.
Do you think they would reject that? They would.
Yeah, I think they would want to say no. We're not like that. Although if you drill down to it, most of the social ideas that get pushed by these GB News and etc. are pretty similar to what these people would want to push. But yeah, I think most people would actually be appalled by the suggestion I'm making. But I'm still right though, so I just have to live with that.
I mean, I suppose them being appalled by it, regardless of whether you're right, is a better response than embracing it.
I guess, but I think it shows you the problem that, as we talked about before, there is such a clear divide in a lot of people's heads between Christianity or religion in general and politics, right? And although they might think, well, my Christianity might influence how I vote, they don't necessarily see that as a much more multifaceted interface between the two, right? Like actually the way that you choose to be religious, the way that you profess your faith, the way that you choose to act in the world based on your faith is a deeply political thing.
Yeah.
Let's take a break from talking about Paul Marshall and his folk-loving family and move on to a bit of a Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Adam, I believe you have a Saint of the Week for us.
So this week I'm going to be talking about an anarcho-communist priest in the Church of England, a guy called Gresham Kirkby, who died in 2006.
You've got to hit me with that name again. That is fantastic.
It is a great name, isn't it? Gresham Kirkby.
Wonderful. You don't meet a lot of Greshams knocking about these days, I'm going to say it.
So this is a rarity for Saint of the Week, right? Because I don't think there's anything bad about this guy. Like normally we do a Saint of the Week.
Well, you did say he was an anarcho-communist, so I can think of at least one thing.
Okay, there it is. Anyway, one of the things I love about him, so he studied for ministry at Mirfield, the College of the Resurrection in Mirfield, which is like a very kind of Anglo-Catholic college, but has quite a strong sort of history, a strong tradition of Anglo-Catholic socialism.
So I'm just going to pause here. So you have told me you can't think of anything bad about this person, and the two things I know about them so far is they're an Anglican and an anarcho-communist. So... Well,
I did say he was a priest, so I mean there's a fair chance...
All right, so there we go. There's the third thing.
Yeah. So he trained alongside Trevor Huddleston. I don't know if you've come across Trevor Huddleston before.
I think potentially the episode we have Luke Lana on, he spoke about Trevor Huddleston. But
probably that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah,
that wouldn't surprise me. So Trevor Huddleston was one of these kind of lefty Anglo-Catholic types, and he was a very active anti-apartheid campaigner. And there's a story Desmond Tutu gives where he says that he was in the street with his mum one day, and this guy stepped to one side, lifted his hat and wished them a good morning or something. And Desmond Tutu, as a young boy, couldn't believe this and asked his mum why a white man had, treated them well, essentially. And she said to him, because he was a man of God. And that apparently is what Desmond Tutu used to quote as the inspiration for him becoming a priest in the Anglican Church later on. So that's Trevor Huddleston, pretty cool guy. Gresham Kirkby trained alongside him. There's no hint that he didn't like him or anything, but apparently considered him rather conservative, which I greatly enjoy because by Anglican standards, Trevor Huddleston was anything but.
Wonderful stuff.
So Gresham Kirkby was active in a number of areas, a number of campaigns and so on. He was very active in, I think it was CND, but certainly in the kind of anti-nuclear scene. Apparently, he was probably the first priest jailed for his anti-nuclear activities, which happened in 1961.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he was also involved in the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship and Jubilee, which is an Anglican socialist group. And he was chair of the London Christian Anarchists in the 60s and the Socialist Christian League in the 50s. He said that he was influenced, his sort of key influences were Dorothy Day, which you'd expect, and Peter Kropotkin. So there's a wonderful quote. In fact, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to read from an article from libcom.org. And the fact that I'm reading from libcom.org, that's a libertarian communist website, basically, an anarchist website. The fact that I'm quoting an article from this website about a priest tells you a hell of a lot about the character of this guy, because it's a positive article, and anarchists, there are anarchist Christians, but they tend to be in a stream that isn't sort of directly influenced by the communism, the sort of anarcho-communist
I mean, it's a classic phrase, right, of anarchism is no gods, no bedtimes. So there's a, the no gods is fairly key, right?
So yeah, it tells you a lot about him. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph of that, which is only a few lines. It can't be often, unfortunately, that the bishop of a major country's capital city, having visited an elderly priest feared to be dying, and then phones a past archbishop's former chaplain, a sometime mentor of the present archbishop, to say he spoke of the kingdom of God and proclaimed his undying belief in anarchy, which I think is an absolutely wonderful quote. Being on your deathbed and proclaiming your undying belief in both the kingdom of God and anarchy. I think that's heroic stuff. There's also another thing that I saw. There's an obituary from The Guardian that was written by Ken Leach, who was a very sort of well-known lefty sort of Anglican priest. He actually died in 2015 himself. But he wrote this obituary in The Guardian for Gresham Kirkby. And it's got this wonderful line where it just says, he had no sympathy with reformist socialism, especially the Blairite version of it, which is just wonderful. I think that's, again, he seems to me like a real character. But there's an article, I think it's actually a blog post that I was reading by Steve Burrows, who I don't know, but he wrote a long and interesting article about him. So again, quoting the former Bishop of London, someone who we've been critical of in the past, I certainly have been, but he does have this wonderful quote where he says, I utterly repudiate that Father Gresham Kirkby was a charming eccentric. That is to trivialise him. And then he quotes a guy called John Pierce, Prebendary John Pierce, a local priest to whom Father Gresham went for confession. It says, John Pierce said that Gresham was the holiest priest he knew, which I think is really borne out actually in his theology. So he wrote something that we won't talk too much about it today, but maybe we'll talk about it another day. But he wrote about the kingdom of God, and he conceptualized this in much the same way as many of us on the left do actually in this essay, as basically something that was here, not just in a distant kind of ethereal realm up in the sky or something, and that it was a really sort of transformative force for societal change. I think one of the things I really appreciate about this is the egalitarian nature of it. He's very, very clear about that. And I think that comes through as well. Interestingly, given that we've been quoting the former Bishop of London, one of the things that I think is very interesting is that he was apparently very, very skeptical, being an anarchist, you would expect this, but very skeptical of bishops, of any of this sort of church hierarchy. One of the fascinating things is that the church that he became vicar of was bombed in the war. Right. And he sought out 2 architects to co-design this new church building with him. And he specifically chose them because of what he'd seen them do in the past. And he co-designed this church with them that was deliberately designed to have all the services in the round. His thing was that he didn't really want to be putting the priest at a sort of elevated level away from the people, that the priest should be down, in the people. The people should be playing a huge part as well, which is reflected in the design of this church, which you can see, and it has become a listed building. So it's a grade 2 listed building, which is fairly unusual for a church that was built in 1960. So you can still go and see that, St Paul's Bow Common in East London, and you will see that the whole thing is designed in that very sort of egalitarian way. He deliberately didn't include a pulpit in the design.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I was going to say, which is someone who is very skeptical of too much of an emphasis placed on preaching, on what one person is telling you to think and so on. I really enjoy that. We've had Chris Howson on before, who's very, very good at having these services where, rather than listen to one sort of old white guy talking at you from on high, you sit down together and you discuss the readings. And I think, again, that spirit of egalitarianism, that sort of anti-hierarchical kind of thing was very, very present in Gresham Kirkby. I'll finish with another story from the blog by Steve Burrows, because it really makes me laugh. So it was towards the end of his life in 2006. I think it would have been just before the World Cup was happening, and England were playing Trinidad and Tobago. But all the locals had all their England flags up, and a neighbour asked him if he had his England flag ready for the big game. And apparently he replied, and I'll just quote this, "A plague on all their houses. I'm Cornish. I support Trinidad and Tobago. David should beat Goliath." Then he placed his hands together and raised them to his chin in a takeoff of petitionary prayer and intoned in a mock pious way, Oh Lord, please send Trinidad and Tobago a goal, Lord. Help them to win, Lord. Oh Lord, Trinidad has suffered at the hands of Britain and the Empire. Help them now to smite the enemy on its hindquarters. Oh Lord, send them a goal. So he was obviously a right laugh as well. And I said earlier that he wasn't simply just a character, but I think we get the impression from that he definitely was one as well. So that's the Saint of the Week for this week.
Yeah.
Obviously joking at the start, but I honestly couldn't find anything bad about him. I just found some things that were funny. I found some idiosyncrasies and whatever, but he seemed like a genuinely good person who was very, very committed to his anarchism.
I really like that. That's got a lot to it, and someone I hadn't heard of. Doesn't necessarily seem to be as big a name, but certainly a cool person who seems to have done a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah, that's a very good Saint of the Week. Thank you for that, Adam.
Saint of the Week.
To return to our main topic, Adam, I'm going to give you a little bit of a quiz.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you some names, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what links these names. You ready?
Go on then.
Angus Winther, Nicola Pease, Jeremy Herman, Harry Lawson Johnston, and Toby Baxendale.
I mean, they're going to all be Tories, aren't they, with names like that?
Yeah, okay. I think you're hitting on one of the things that relates to them all, and it's interesting you've noticed the names. They are all super rich. Insurance, investment managers, venture capitalists, and the like. I'm
not the biggest fan of Family Guy, but it sort of reminds me of one of the sort of fringe characters that you've seen in 1 or 2 episodes of Family Guy, and his name is James William Bottomtooth III.
And this is our Writers' Lounge, where you'll meet some of our contributors. Fielding Wellingtonsworth. Hello. Livingston Winsterford. Yes. Amelia Bedford Furthington Chesterhill.
Good day.
And James William Bottomtooth.
Oh, no. Harry Lawson Johnston is a particularly, that's a good one. What relates to all of them, apart from being super rich, is that they are all board members of the Church Revitalisation Trust that Paul Marshall is also a major donor and board member of, which is, as I mentioned earlier, one of those HTB things. And the reason I bring them up is that none of them really have any public profile whatsoever. They aren't involved in any of the bids to be part of, any media organizations. They probably don't have Twitter like most smart rich people. They are not people with any sort of public profile beyond their business dealings. One of them is actually a church warden of Holy Trinity Brompton, but most of them are involved in some form of evangelical Christianity or another. And the reason I bring them up is I do not believe that those people are any less dangerous than Paul Marshall. I don't believe that they are any better than Paul Marshall is. But if a couple of them banded together and tried to buy the Spectator and the Telegraph, no one would really have too much problem with it. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, for all that Paul Marshall is an awful person, that it's not just about what you happen to put on your social media that makes you a dangerous person. There are people who they might not even think of themselves as particularly political, but are just as involved as putting right-wing Christianity in this country, prepared to put time and money on the table to push certain agendas, and just don't have the same profile.
And actually, there's perhaps an element of that you could argue is even more dangerous, because if you can't see it going on, then you can't call it out.
Yeah. I think this is what Paul Marshall actually gives certain organisations an opportunity to do. Because if you go, well, that's disgusting, and I haven't seen what the response of HDB or Church Revitalisation Trust or any of those people has been. But if they go, well, we distance ourselves from that, Paul Marshall's going to leave our board, it's not going to be involved anymore, blah, 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 blah. People then go, well, okay, they've done the right thing. They've pushed this person away. But the reality is that even if they wouldn't put it in the same terms, the people that remain involved in these organisations are ultimately pushing towards the same goal as Paul Marshall. The reality is Paul Marshall does not expect to do mass deportations of anyone who is not, European, going back hundreds of years. Right? That is not a real political possibility. He might like the idea, but it's not going to happen. And so ultimately, the difference between him dreaming of that and pushing towards massively reduced migration, massively reduced refugees and deportations and the Rwanda scheme and all that, and people who think it's horrific to suggest that people from ethnic minorities should be deported, but do think actually we should have less refugees and push out people who have emigrated to this country recently. Ultimately, the effect is the same, but apparently Paul Marshall is worse and more dangerous.
I guess it's part of the reason that those of us on the left will often moan a little bit about becoming too overly concerned with the morality of something rather than the material reality of it. And I guess that's something we can say about this is like, yeah, okay, there is a moral element to it. Of course there is. But actually, we need to be more focused on what's going on and how do we stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not to say that ideological things don't have impact on real materiality, right? The reason that we're talking about how evil a publication like The Spectator is because the things they publish impact on real world material things. So it's not just, well, you can say what you like, you can print what you like, as long as you don't do anything, because that's a very naive approach. But it is recognizing that if you're pushing for the same things, but one of you has more extreme beliefs in public than the other, actually, that's not as important as the fact that your two people are pushing for the same outcomes.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I want to talk a little bit about, there's a certain type of response, which is, I think, the kind of response that I have some sympathy for, but I think misses a key point, which is the sort of response that says, well, this person has been allowed to gain influence, and they've been, partly it's because of a class thing. Paul Marshall is posh. He's able to talk in the right way, schmooze in the right way, but also money talks. And if you're going to organizations and prepared to drop millions on various things, whether that's a church or a parachurch organization, people are going to want to listen to you. And there's this sense that some people are saying, well, the problem is, letting people buy influence, rather than just believing what you're going to believe and letting the money flow in. And I think that's to miss the more important point, which is it is not possible to be a moral millionaire. There is no moral way of earning that amount of money. Paul Marshall, he was a hedge fund manager. One of the things he got rich off was betting against Carillion when Carillion fell to pieces. That cost huge amounts of taxpayer money that could have been, and I don't want to get into too much of the taxpayer money thing, but the reality is money that could have been, even if it might not have been, could have been spent on, social infrastructure, instead went down the drain on Carillion, which was, by the way, owned by Philip Green, who is also an evangelical Christian, because they get everywhere. But actually, being a hedge fund manager is immoral. Like, I kind of, it sounds like such a, I don't know, almost like a naive point, but there isn't a way of earning that amount of money that doesn't fundamentally boil down to exploiting people. And whether that's direct exploitation, or whether that's much more indirect forms of exploitation, ultimately, if someone comes in with that amount of money and you're a Christian organization, the only response is to say what Jesus said to the rich young ruler: sell everything, give that money away, make amends for the fact that you brought in this money immorally, and then we can chat. And, people talk about, they're salving their conscience by giving away this money, or, the classic thing of, well, God's given them that money to use in a positive way. But actually, I think the only genuine Christian response, the only properly Christian, I won't say genuinely, that's not right. The only properly Christian response is to say, you have got that money through exploiting others. You have got that money through not respecting the spark of divinity, the image of God in every single person, and instead treating them as something you can profit off. And therefore, we don't want your money until you make amends for what you've done.
That really gets back to something we were talking about in last week's episode. And it's that the church needs to become smaller. It needs to kind of die to be reborn.
Yeah.
And that is a scary idea, and obviously, you and I might say, well, that's the gospel, have some faith in God rather than, faith in this businessman's money. I mean, there's a fairly consistent thread in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, of rejecting just the idea that being rich can be a moral thing, that actually riches all stem from injustice.
Yeah, and I think as Christians and Marxists, there's an interesting interplay there. To some extent, there's almost a sense, and I don't mean this in a sense that I thought this, then this, but, intellectually, you can almost understand it as it's Christianity that teaches me that being rich is exploitative, that it's something that is not good, that is dangerous, and it's Marxism that explains to me how and why that is the case. Actually, Christianity provides me that moral core to say being a multimillionaire is wrong, and Marxism explains to me how that actually functions and what the exploitation is that causes you to become that person.
Wait, are you saying that the Bible isn't necessarily sufficient for all
Yes,
things?
I am saying that.
Whoa.
I know that people will still believe that. Or, no, actually, I'm going to be controversial, Adam. I think people still say they believe that, but actually their actions show you that no one actually believes that the Bible just, is fully sufficient for any sort of Christian life, right? Like it doesn't make any sense as a statement, and you claim to believe it, and you may even convince yourself that you believe it more as a way of marking who's in and who's out than as an actual guiding principle to your life, because the reality is you just can't live that way. The Bible is such a complicated and rich and fascinating but often quite unclear and contradictory document that to say that it's sufficient is clearly nonsense.
I mean, this is the thing. People who believe that a very particular understanding of the Bible, a particular reading of the Bible, is what's sufficient. Right? It's absolutely full of ideological presuppositions that you have to adopt in place of actually trying to understand it for what it is on its own terms.
Yeah, and as you say, that sufficiency thing, the reality is they don't think it's sufficient because they're clawing after money. They like to have rich people. They like to have money to put on big events or do big ventures and all the rest of this stuff, because they don't, I don't want to say we have more faith than or anything like that, but the reality is that our argument here is to say, look at the lilies of the field. That's a Bible reference for you there. Who says we're not a Christian podcast, really? They neither toil or spin, and yet
I nearly bleeps that, by the way.
The God in heaven gives them everything they need. That's not an exact quote, but it's roughly right. And Jesus is making the point that actually you work and work and work and do yourself into bits to earn money to get the stuff you need for life. And actually that indicates a lack of trust in God. Now, that doesn't mean that we should all go on the dole and not bother, partially because it's quite difficult to live that way, if we're honest. But at the same time, actually, if you are, chasing after a man like Paul Marshall, or even if you're just happy for Paul Marshall or his mates that aren't as controversial but still have earned an absolute shit ton of money through doing ethically dubious things, if you're happy for them to be in your midst, if you're happy to use their money to do the things you want, that indicates a lack of trust in God, ultimately. If you're launching all these new centers and trusts and organizations that are doing all these new projects and, throwing money and resources and time at doing stuff, ultimately, does it not indicate a lack of faith, a lack of trust in God's ability to get stuff done?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And of course, this is something that we do see carrying through very much at an institutional level. Just focusing on HTB. HTB is the richest parish church in the UK by some distance. It has a budget of £10 million a year. It has 118 staff. This is larger than many dioceses,
Yeah.
And yet what comes out of that, look, I'm sure there are some good things that come out of that. It's never going to be an entirely positive or negative picture. But the fact is that HTB now occupies a position within the Church of England that is self-reinforcing, right? It has a position of considerable power to the point where, a lot of funding goes to the HTB network, and a lot of churches that really need funding can't get it and end up being often taken over by, essentially the Revitalised Trust, by the HTB network, because they couldn't get the resources that they needed.
By Paul Marshall. right?
Well, yeah. that they needed in the first place, and that is evidence of, frankly, a lack of faith in God.
You heard it here first, everyone. Evil hedge fund managers are coming to take over a nice little church near you. Which, actually, it sounds stupid, but that is basically kind of what we're saying, that actually these people are got huge amounts of influence, both politically and in the church world, because they're rich, and that is exceptionally dangerous.
Yeah.
Rich people, bad. I know a controversial take for this podcast to go down, but I think I feel confident in it.
But it does. I mean, some of it is so bloody obvious as well. You know, I mean, this point that you're making about essentially money leading to power and influence. I still remember a sermon that Ken Costa, I think I've spoken about it before, but
like
Ken
100
Costa
times,
gave.
yeah.
All right, sorry. All right.
I would say if you were doing the Bread and Rosaries bingo card, Adam talks about the Ken Costa sermon would be dead.
It was so bad, though. It was so bad. He literally played a long video of. Do you remember the what was it? The Golden Jubilee.
Yeah.
Of Elizabeth Windsor, and they had this literal golden barge floating down the Thames, and he just. I mean, he was. I'm trying not to be too crude in how I say this, but Ken Costa was absolutely loving that. He was almost sexual in his enjoyment of this golden barge. I mean, go figure. The rich business, he's probably a hedge fund manager as well, isn't he? You know, the rich businessman practically. No, I'm not going to say that, but like, you know, losing his mind about a golden barge, you know, like, and of course, power is attracted to power, you know, like this person has even more power than I do. Wow, they're amazing, you know. And he played this long video that was so boring, and then spoke at length about how bloody marvelous the Queen was. Oh, anyway, sorry. Yeah, you can all put your bingo cards away. I'm gonna be quiet now.
So the conclusion of this episode: rich people is bad, and Adam believes that Ken Costa is sexually aroused by golden barges.
Well, yeah.
I cannot think of a better point to end a podcast on.
No, but I do want to make that point very clear, though. That
he was definitely sexually aroused. Is that
no, that's not the point. No, the point is, would he be in that position? Would he be up on that stage talking about this stuff, reinforcing the power that already exists, if he himself didn't already have power and wealth? No, I don't think he would.
Well, it's something about it's amazing how often that the gift of preaching is given to those who went to public school, right? Like, you know, like actually, yeah, you're absolutely right. Is that person up on stage because they have a real gift for expounding the message of God to the people of God, or are they up on the stage because they earned a shit ton of money doing stuff that is probably wrong, and therefore they're held up on a platform?
Yeah. And look, there are so many more things we could talk about around this if we had time, and unfortunately we don't. But one of the things I do want to say is that we've seen a lot of safeguarding issues in churches like HTB and associated with HTB. And this way of dealing with power and wealth creates a culture of control and of secrecy.
Yeah.
And that is what breeds those kinds of scandals, those kinds of safeguarding incidents and issues. And not only that, but it breeds the cover-ups that then follow as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, we talk about cover-ups, and I'm not saying that the people involved in HTB covered up Paul Marshall's views, but the reality is, as I said earlier, people would have been aware what Paul Marshall thought, and they were still happy to have him heavily involved in the things they were doing. That's not the same as covering up a safeguarding issue, I know, but actually, oh, well, he's all right, and, you know, he's helped out a lot and whatever, so maybe we don't need to make such a big deal of this stuff. It's kind of the same logic at play in both those cases, you know, cringing before power and wealth, in a way that actually lets people down in the long term.
And power and wealth in the service, actually, of expansion, right? Because this is the thing that HTB and the sort of evangelical wing are obsessed over. They believe that the most important role of the church is not providing pastoral care or anything to people, is not being a witness to justice and love and so on. It's making themselves bigger. It's making sure that they get people to join them who believe and say the right things and come to their church. And again, part of it is bringing money in as well. And that only feeds into that cycle as well.
Yeah, it's a kind of a colonial logic, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And it's, it's probably not irrelevant that I reckon if you drill down into a lot of these people's sources of wealth, exploitation of the global south in a neo-colonialist form would probably be at the root of a decent chunk of their money. The logic of colonialism, we might not, as Britain, we might not have an empire anymore, but the logic of colonialism is still rampant, and a lot of stuff around kind of church planting, around even that language of revitalization and bringing proper Christianity back into this country. There is colonial overtones to all of this stuff. I think that will have to do us for this week. I think we could both carry on ranting for some time, but I have to go to bed. So thank you very much, as always, Adam. It has been a pleasure. I think this is the longest I've not been on the podcast. So, apologies to everyone that you have to put up with my voice. Pity us, because when we edit it, we have to listen to ourselves. And if you think we're annoying, when you only have to listen once, imagine listening to this again and again. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
And you can find me most places at Commie, Xian.
And if you want to get hold of the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. It's really great to get feedback, questions, suggestions, ideas, even a little bit of hate mail now and again. Or the lovely person who messaged our Facebook page, doesn't follow it, asking if we had a good recipe for a basic white bread roll, and maybe hasn't caught on to the pun in the name of the thing and thinks we're a bread-making Facebook page.
Yeah. We should get them on as a guest.
Yeah, God love you, sir. That is wonderful. And I will send you my recipe for a good bread roll.
I was going to do the same. So.
But if you want to, get in touch with us with slightly more relevant feedback, pretty much everything is available on our website, breadandrosaries.com. Links in the description for anything else you might want to get hold of. Podcast in all the usual podcast feedy places.
But we will also provide bread roll recipes if you want us to.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I'm not the best bread maker in the world, but I've got a few decent recipes that do all right. Thank you very much for listening to us, as always, and we will see you next time. Cheers, Adam.
Cheers. See you later.
Bye.